In 2023, Windstone Wallboards will open its new jib plasterboard manufacturing and distribution facility in Tauriko, Tauranga. Built on 12.8 hectares of land, it will be 2.5 times bigger than the current site. Designed with sustainability at the forefront, the new plant will have extensive recycling capability on site for water and waste. It will also include new state-of-the-art technology and equipment, enabling the business to manufacture the full range of our jib plasterboard products with a high degree of flexibility. The new Windstone Wallboards facility reinforces our commitment to manufacturing in New Zealand, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you.
Welcome, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Michael Milojevic, a professional teaching fellow here at the University of Auckland School of Architecture and Planning. In a couple of minutes, we'll have with us our man in Paris, Brendan MacFarlane, director of Jakob MacFarlane Architects. This spring 2021 Fast Forward program of conversations with outstanding alumni abroad is organized by Julia Gatley and Elizabeth Aitken-Rose on behalf of the school's History and Theory Research Hub. This, the fourth conversation, is again sponsored by JIB, who have been steadfast in their support for the school's Fast Forward programs for many years running now. So bravo, JIB. During this evening's conversation, we invite your questions. Just use the Zoom Q&A function, and Brendan and I will see what's there towards the end of the hour. Well, Christchurch-born and Wellington-raised Brendan MacFarlane is a leading French architect. With his partner, Dominique Jakob, their joint practice was founded in 1998 as they were catapulted onto the Paris scene with a prominent commission in which they privileged innovative digital technology. Since that time, their experimental and sometimes biomorphic form making has set them apart and drawn much praise and numerous awards. They have realized a constellation of significant and award-winning cultural and housing projects in the French capital, but also in Lyon, Orléans, Limousin, Montpellier, La Rochelle, and Pont-Audemer. And in Belgian cities, they have now a school of architecture on the go at Mont and an innovative vertical village housing tower at Knokke-Heist, which is right on the coast near Bruges, I take it. I first came to realize the scope of MacFarlane's achievements in planning the itinerary for the 2014 Alpine Studio study tour when two exceptional and eye-poppingly bright urban markers for the Confluence Quartier in Lyon were among our must-see destinations there. They were done by a Kiwi. Wow. The 2017 Alpine Tour program revisited both these projects. So in all, well over 100 Auckland students have gazed over and into the Cube Orange. As you can see, it's a cyclopean object with a conoid void cored out one corner and up through the center. Just a few hundred meters down the same Saône embankment is this intensely lime green Euronews block, which has a pair of oculi which also morph into atria for light, air, and river views. I think you'll agree it's all quite deformative, just like, as I've learned in the past week, Brendan likes things. From the start in life, MacFarlane took himself generally in a northeastwardly trajectory, starting in the South Island and ending up in the Île-de-France. Well, not long after high school, architecture seemed like it might be his thing. He did his first year here at Auckland, followed by a couple of years in Sydney, including time at Harry Seidler's office, and then a long, deep engagement in the LA scene at SCI-Arc and Morphosis, followed then by a master's at Harvard GSD, that rounded out the 1980s. London was next, before coming to a rest, so to speak, in Paris in the early in the early 90s, where he and Dominique Jakob, who was herself a SCI-Arc Morphosis veteran, met. Brendan and Dominique have long engaged with the Academy. Brendan has held multi-year teaching posts at the Bartlett and the AA in London, the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, and SCI-Arc in LA, while being simultaneously much in demand as a speaker at architecture events worldwide. It's important to signal that the quality of Jakob and MacFarlane's media has meant that they have exhibited continuously and widely: the Centre Pompidou, San Francisco MoMA, the Venice Biennale, SCI-Arc, the Victorian Albert, the Mori Art Museum, Archilab FRAC, and the EDES Architecture Forum. And at the moment, they have a big model in the 2021 Seoul Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism, and they're showing a film at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow next month. While I've left out more than I've recounted here, I must add that this year, the distinguished French publishing house Flammarion has come out with a hefty tome on the first 2 decades of Jakob and MacFarlane. And it's, by the way, the first monograph on their work. So, good morning, Brendan.
Good morning.
How are you?
Very good.
Before we scroll back through the decades to hear about a Christchurch boy ending up in France, please tell us a bit about your practice. Am I right in saying that you're located in the Rue des Petites Écuries in the 10th arrondissement? That's the, I think, historic center, about 30 minutes stroll to the great fire reconstruction site of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. So if you could just tell me, sort of us, how many you are and what's the practice like in the time of COVID for you? For as I understand it, you have projects throughout the country and of course across the border in Belgium. Does a pass sanitaire vaccination work there?
It's a good question. Thank you for having me, Michael, and Auckland University. For me, it's actually really fantastic to talk to you guys because in a way, it's something which I've never done, you know, since leaving Auckland University. It's the first kind of contact. So it's, for me, it's a sort of historical, emotional, you know, sort of coming around in a circle. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, to talk about the pass sanitaire is it's where France is today. You know, we have a we went like you guys are now coming through these different phases in New Zealand, which I'm following really carefully. You know, from lockdown 4, 3, 2, all of these different levels. France, thank heavens we've sort of gone, hopefully we've gone through that. And of course we are now in this pass sanitaire, which means that we can, but to get a coffee, we need to show our pass sanitaire in Paris, just to give you an extreme example. So, you know,
at least you can get a coffee.
When you go in and ask for just a simple thing like a coffee, you need to show your it's an ID, and you know, it gives you your name, your age, and your and of course it's the code, and that gives us access also onto trains. It gives us access onto planes. It gives us access into, for example, going north of France. You know, you mentioned with Belgium. Yeah. So in a way, I think it's a freedom of movement which we've, you know, essentially collectively earned, and you know, of course, there's a certain amount of you know, manifestation, you know, and people against, you know, this idea of freedom and the idea of identifying yourself, you know, because in a way somehow it's this aspect of society, you know, how free are we today with COVID, and how maybe the COVID thing has also led to a certain, you know, some people say control, you know, where we are now identified. If I get that coffee in the morning, they know where, at what time I was there, in what location, the following day, etc. So in fact, my life can be you know, that's information, that's data that I'm creating. And that will not, the pass sanitaire doesn't look as though it's going to stop. It's something which will probably continue and become something else. So It's
Yeah.
we're living in, you know, intriguing, interesting, strange, conflictual times. In terms of you know, our office, it's true, our office is right in the center of Paris. And it's something that we really love because we can walk out, you know, and we can be really close to events and things. And it's true that when the Notre Dame went up in flames, I walked out. I ran, and I ran down the boulevard. I didn't even get in the metro, and it was within not even half an hour. It was within like 15 minutes, you know, of being in front of this vision of a kind of nightmare. That was certainly a totally powerful point. Anyway.
Yeah, and so just tell us a bit about the size of your practice and what you've got on just today before we start going back, just so we get a sense of, yeah.
So we're about 20 people, and we are the 10th arrondissement is an interesting arrondissement because it's an area where there's a huge mixity of people. It's very close to the two train stations, one that's linked into London and one that's linked into Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. And though we would be within about 4 minutes walk from those train stations. So it's in the north of Paris. And the office is located in an old atelier that used to make cloth, which is just in a northern area of Paris. Sorry, I should say just north of the center. And it was a very famous area for working, the garment district, really, the equivalent of New York. And they were making a lot of clothing, cheap clothing that would go all over the world. And there still is remnants of that, but that's been, you know, over the last 10 years, architects, people in communication, designers have moved into this area because it's been cheap. And that's a thing of the past now. It's no longer cheap. You know, it's an area which has changed really radically since we've been here. But somehow we've been part of that, you know, and that's another whole story. But our office is in the heart of that area.
Oh, wow. Sounds really interesting. I noticed this morning that Ledoux once built a building on your street, and of course it's been overbuilt since then.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, in my introduction, I rattled off, you know, your itinerant years as an architecture student, but maybe just indulge us. Take us 4 decades back to, you know, 1980, 81, when you started in architecture before you headed to Sydney. What was your experience at the Auckland School? And, you know, I guess it was first year you were in, right? Or was there an intermediate? How did that work? And what do you make of the atmosphere teaching students, teachers? You know, what was that? Do you have any?
Well, I have a great memory of the atmosphere, and I've always referred to it as kind of like a family because it was an extraordinary period. And you had, I think you had, somehow the students seemed as interesting as the professors. And, you know, and interesting is maybe just not the word. They almost seemed on an equivalent level. So when I talk about family, it was a kind of family that got on. Yeah. There was a sort of incredible interest in a kind of spirit in Auckland. I came from Dunedin in Wellington. Yeah. And it wasn't, you know, all of a sudden I found myself in this, first of all, Auckland, just the light alone is an amazing city. It's got this Pacific light. And for me, it was discovering that and light and color, you know, which have always been fundamental for me. And I think Auckland embodied that. And I think the people that were there at that period of time certainly were, you know, it was the 80s, there was a lot going on culturally around the world. You know, you had incredible kind of music scenes. You had a cafe scene that was just developing. And you know, those kind of memories, the people that were running that. What I lived in was in what's the gully just north of Auckland University? I forget.
Grafton.
Grafton, thank you. It was within, you know, 3 minutes walk. It's no longer there, it's demolished, but it was an old rundown house with a huge veranda. Hadn't been painted in about 50, 60 years. And I was basically, it was housing about 8 Elam students. And I took over my bedroom was literally, I took over my bedroom from a lady called Elizabeth Farrelly. who of course have gone on and done extraordinary things as both a journalist and teacher, etc. in Sydney. But she became a very good friend, and that was my bedroom. And I went into this whole milieu of really amazing photographers, actors. There was the Foundry in Auckland. That was the core part of the apartment. And there was, of course, the architecture part, which I sort of was a flag, one room, which represented architecture. So that was in a way, my incredible memories of Auckland, great creativity, and all of that, of course, was very much part of. It was the ELIM, it was the Auckland Architecture School.
Yeah.
It was also it was downtown Auckland, and as I said, the cafe scene, I think some very interesting people. So a great atmosphere. I have really great memories of that.
Yeah. Did you have drawing with Pat Handley, or do you?
Absolutely, completely. Yeah. Pat Handley was an extraordinary teacher. Yeah. And so, of course, it was on these famous expeditions where we would just leave the school and wander around, into the parks, across the, across the bridge, into different areas of Auckland, and do his famous, just big idea. And that's, of course, the big idea was you had a teacher able to encapsulate somehow into a very simple phrase, actually what he was doing, what in a way creativity is about. And in a sense, of course, it wasn't that simple, but I think he was a great teacher in that way, because in a sense, he made it accessible for everyone and generated an incredible ambience. So I have great memories of Pat Handley.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I need to move on because in preparation for this conversation, I discovered in our library, when I looked you up, that we hold a catalog from SCI-Arc from '85 called Desert Motel, which I think you were then a design tutor for Tom Main. I'm sort of putting it together. You must correct me if I'm wrong. And in the school centenary year, our staff selected some treasures from the library's collection, and what came up tops was the Morphosis catalog and edition by Peter Cook, and from '85, and to realize that that's where you took yourself in the middle of the '80s, where so many desired to be. Maybe just can you tell us about the LA years, SCI-Arc, and then working at Morphosis?
Yeah, it's interesting. I discovered Morphosis through going to Sydney, going to Australia, and then actually, coming up with the kind of wacky idea that it wasn't necessarily going back to New Zealand, but it was going on and exploring the world as well as continuing my education. So I was sort of pre-Erasmus. And I was doing my own Erasmus, and in that sense, that was really the reason why I wanted to leave Auckland, continue on to Sydney. Had originally thought I would come back to Auckland, but then in Sydney realized that it was interesting to kind of move around and see if I could continue. So I went into America. And went around America and discovered Los Angeles was actually one of the most amazing creative cities at that point. And there was a group in Los Angeles, Morphosis was just one of them, among other people, Frank, of course, being a slightly older generation, and then a younger group somehow around him. They were people like Eric Moss, Robert Mangurian. I mean, it goes on. There was a list. There was maybe about 8 of them, and all doing or have just finished sort of in the last 2 or 3 years, extraordinary, what we call sort of case study houses. And they weren't the case study houses of the 60s and 70s, which, the Neutra and all of those, and Schindler that we've sort of come to know very well in beautiful photos. But they were a kind of a recent generation of architects that had just got out of school, and in a sense, their first commissions were very tiny. And Morphosis, of course, had built this thing called the 2468 house. And a lot of these additions were in places like Venice Beach and Santa Monica, etc. And the 2468 was a house built on top of a garage in the back of a house on a kind of a mid-block driveway. And that was just one of a number of additions that had been thrown up. When I saw those, because I went, of course, around Los Angeles, thinking it would be, very interesting to kind of come back to the city and do my education, I was just blown away because it was a level of creativity which, of course, I hadn't seen anywhere else in the world. So for me, going to Los Angeles was, in a strange way, I've always said it was like coming home in a weird way. It was the New Zealand suburb combined with a whole lot of other things. There's bits of Auckland in Los Angeles. There's bits of Christchurch from my childhood in a state house. There's a lot of things. But in a way, what I found in Los Angeles, which interested me, was in a cinematic way, everything is exaggerated. The light is 10 times as bright. Green grass doesn't look green. It looks positively, mercurial.
So green.
Materials that were used in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very interesting, wacky, mad materials. And this idea of these kind of strange manicured gardens. And of course, all of the, let's say, the artists that were around capturing that. You had the artists like Ed Ruscha, who was sort of like literally just photographing that and making these extraordinary publications. And then you had other artists working in a way with the medium, going back into the medium of light, and of course that whole generation of light artists that were capturing a kind of abstraction, like Robert Irwin or James Turrell. And so all of a sudden I found in Los Angeles, there was this extraordinary artistic, architectural, very, very rich scene. And it was a scene that very much was, I think, already exploring things that I was very much interested in myself. Having grown up in New Zealand, for me, Los Angeles, as I said, was just a continuity of the suburbia. And that's always been really interesting to me. I've never seen it as something negative. I've always seen it as something actually very beautiful.
Absolutely.
And so that, in a sense, Los Angeles, then, just getting to the SCI-Arc thing, my discoveries of SCI-Arc was, driving around, being told that, I had to go and visit this wacky school down in Santa Monica, and which I did, and I arrived in this car park, and there was this shed from the 1940s that had been used to build military aircraft. And, I walked in, and inside was scaffolding. And all of these levels on which students were working away inside all of this kind of scaffolding, wood construction. And in the middle of it all, there was a basketball game going on. And I thought, hang on, I'm in the wrong place. This is not an architecture school. And of course it was the heart, the basketball. Of course, when I say of course, it's, one found all of this out, but of course they would take the net down. The basketball court really was the general assembly space. All of the lectures would go on there, as well as all sorts of other stuff. And I found myself in this extraordinary environment with about 30 other students that were living in the school. I had no money. And of course I stayed on and lived in this, scaffolding structure, come whatever, ruche, hive, for at least sort of like a year and a half, 2 years, until I could get myself settled. But that was great. That was exactly what I was sort of looking for. So anyway.
So exciting. And then you moved on to Harvard GSD. Different. That was kind of finishing school, I presume, for for all the experimentation and moving on. And what was, who was the, what did you do? What was your thesis? What did you do? And
it's interesting, the thesis that I was, absolutely. It's Harvard. It is interesting because it's like you couldn't be two things more extreme. The experimental, wacky. A school that didn't even have its, a certificate recognized by the state of California. We all went through this thing. It was mad. It was started in the 1960s by a bunch of hippies. And then you have Harvard, which of course is the absolute opposite of that. So it was in a sense, it was culture shock. And in a sense, it was interesting to do for somehow that reason, because what happened at Harvard was that I saw all the stuff that I probably never saw in Los Angeles. And all the stuff that I was probably not meant to see or would see later in Europe. And so Harvard for me was like Europe. It's very European, the East Coast. It's extremely influenced by, you know, all of the history of Europe. And you know, and I've always made this joke in terms of, you know, I came across this word called, or someone at school at Harvard said, "What's your?" Yeah, it's very nice, but what's your precedent? And I thought, what the hell is a precedent? It was a word I'd never come across in my life.
Oh, really? Oh, goodness.
And I was tortured. First of all, I thought it was president. And I thought, well, hang on, who's my president? Good question. We don't have presidents in New Zealand. The prime minister.
Oh, wow.
And then, of course, realizing that is the East Coast. That's very much it's the story of, okay, we like the idea, but, you know, intellectually, where are you coming from? What's the background? What's behind you? What's before you? And that was a kind of a complete wake-up call, which I had absolutely not discussed in California. California is about forward moving, and that, of course, I'm saying that for me as a personal experience. I'm not going to sort of generalize it. I don't really want to go there, but it was an experience. It was an absolutely very different experience. But the thesis was a good question, and I wanted to do, well, I don't know in fact what I wanted to do. It was very interesting. I tell you, I chose one thesis which I really wanted to do, and I couldn't do it, and I ended up doing the other, which I was interested in, but it probably wasn't as strong and powerful as the first. The first was that because I'd spent time in Australia, I was extremely interested in, and I'd gone and visited Tasmania. And I was very interested, I've always been interested in this issue of traces, histories, things that have come before me, ironically, not precedents, but, you know, in a way, stuff that's there, but maybe not there, but needs to be pulled out and made apparent. And, you know, the thing that attracted me a lot to Australia was, of course, the ancient civilization, which was the Aboriginal, but of course, once saying ancient, it's a living thing. And Tasmania interested me, trying to do a project there. But at the same time, I was very much interested in this idea of layers. So I found a subject which I thought was very interesting, was to work on a prison colony for women that was just south of Hobart. And I went and visited. I looked at, you know, I did all the research. And it was basically Aboriginal women that had been taken, and men, but essentially women and children that had been taken away from their, you know, their homelands or their villages, etc., because they'd been put into this kind of holding camp. And I said, when I say prison, it was sort of prison, holding camp, etc. And a pretty sad story. I mean, kind of a shocking story. And they were put inside this new town south of Hobart, which is no longer there. It's non-existing. But what I found was the town, the plans, the description of the place, which was very powerful, and some of the people that had gone through there. And I gathered all of that together and actually went down to Tasmania and interviewed, or tried to interview, some family that were, you know, that had generations from the descendants, sorry. And realized that I was coming up against a kind of block, that they didn't want me to go further with the project. And that was an amazing moment. It was essentially tapu land for them. And the subject was very, very powerful. And I think they really did not want anyone to kind of open the thing up at that point. They wanted to open it up themselves. Sure. And that was a very powerful moment, because I came back to Sydney and I was thinking, oh, what the hell am I going to do? You know, I've sort of put myself up against this thing, up against, you know, some pretty powerful feelings, powerful forces. And I understood it and I didn't understand it. You know, there was a lot that I never sort of understood. And then, of course, one asks oneself, yes, but is it even the role of an architect to get oneself involved in that situation? Can you put yourself in that situation? Should other people really be the ones that put you in it and you go into it, that having been invited? I mean, there's a lot of subject matter there, just in terms of what the role of an architect is, what their role that they think it is, and is there even moments when, in fact, you should not even be involved in projects? Yes, of course. The answer is yes, of course. That's a biggie. Anyway, that was a very interesting experience. From that, I jumped back and decided on the Bondi Surf Club, which is absolutely somehow a kind of another extreme of Australian culture.
Well, it sounds like a thesis student, kind of a situation we have, as well. Students not knowing what they want to do, and then having so many ideas, and then being very disparate. It's an old story and a new story. And
it's an old story and a new story. But but anyway, the Harvard was it was an extraordinary. Michael Hayes was my thesis advisor. Wow. I mean, I couldn't have had better people. I had it was an extraordinary period. So I can't say much more. And it really, in fact, is what maybe got me to Europe after that.
Wow. Yeah, because then you headed to London, I understand, and for a brief period before you moved on to Paris. And I guess my before we need to start looking at your work very soon, but just if you could just a few comments around the issue of Paris when you arrive. I mean, the early 90s of the time of the Fondation Cartier by Jean Nouvel, and the Bibliothèque Nationale project was being built by Dominique Perrault, and I guess Christian de Portzamparc and the Cité de la Musique. Did any of that interest? Well, that's all now far from Tasmania and your other topics. It's hard to imagine that could have attracted you.
Yeah. It didn't. It's really interesting what you're saying. In many ways, it didn't. I've always found Nouvel's work very good, and it's exceptional work. And I found a lot of those big projects though big, and I saw them as presidential projects, handed down in a very hierarchical system, and I didn't feel myself as part of that at all. And in fact, I wasn't, or Dominic and I weren't, because what we were literally experiencing was all of that whole generation was a moment in time. And our generation that came after, or, a number of generations after that, there was no more money. There was no more presidential, decrees of these extraordinary
Le Grand Projet.
Yeah, Le Grand Projet. I mean, I think, I found myself closer to people like maybe Bernard Tschumy's La Palette project, of course. Yeah. And I've always thought the failed projects, fail is not the word, the ones that lost, like Koolhaas's library. Yeah. I've always thought what a wonderful, incredible project that would have been, So what we've tended to have chosen and what we've built, as opposed to what actually we could have created or built in Paris, that's an ongoing story. It's a city of, in that sense, it's a city of dreams and realities. And the realities have often shifted towards more monumental projects that served a kind of more political purpose, of course, probably more simple and very direct messages to the public space, but not necessarily the best. And so, those things have happened, and obviously what you've been seeing now in the last 20 years, or in France anyway, or certainly in Paris, has been absolutely the opposite kind of projects. They've been projects concentrating on rebuilding or additions, subtractions, transformations, all of those kind of keywords to do with existing conditions. Yeah. Only because it's not a kind of a theoretical level. It's really literally a kind of almost what was then possible. The boom happened. No longer was the money there and the culture, etc., for those big competitions, which France was very famous for. But of course now it's more about much more lower key. You've been following the work, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, we do need to see your work. So I need to just say that, of course, it's an old story, but it's a great story. You're beginning, with a breakout project with Dominique, the radical intervention on the top floor of the Centre Pompidou for a restaurant, and you were handpicked for the job. I understand you'd been looked at for other work as well, and you delivered something, really some very exceptional forms. I guess I would say they're called deforms, and at least that's how you like to call them. And they're intense colors and light in the piano and Roger's skeleton. And I don't really see Morphosis in Paris here, I don't think, but were you channeling things like, I don't know, Le Corbusier's sculpture or the sculpture of André Bloch? I understand you had a naval architect involved in the design execution, and that may have got you hooked onto the digital. We'd like to hear. Anyway, just if you could tell us how, this project, and of course we'll move on to next projects very, very soon to delve into your oeuvre.
Okay, great. So Michael, on this image here, you can see we're on a terrace outside, and you see above all of the structure, the big, let's call it the charpente, the trusses, all of the air ducts, all of that, and Pompidou's blue. If you look up above that, you have these big blue chimneys bringing air out or in, and mostly out at the top of the building. So it's Pompidou exteriorized, exoskeleton, exo everything. And then on the inside, of course, you still have this incredible tubular system of electricity, water, plumbing coming in from the roof. We were given the space, it's 900 meters squared on the inside. It was a big rectangle, and we were in a competition. Our competition was quite tough. Philippe Starck was our major competitor. And I think Pompidou basically said, if the young generation fails, we have our key man ready. And we were like tortured. We thought, well, obviously they want Philippe. They don't really want the youngies, but they've got the youngies in anyway. So we're about 5 groups. And we, Dominic and I, really, in a sense, we only had this as the one project in the office at that moment. So in a sense, we gave to it, I guess, everything that we had, which, probably shows, I think, in the final piece. Anyway, the point is that this is an aluminium floor, and all of these 4 volumes pop out of that aluminium and become these kind of different spaces. Both the bar is this kind of tubular thing just to the right, and just to the right. So this is kind of the one, and then the kitchen is in the middle, and then we have another spaces like bathrooms and VIP space in the back. Anyway, the point is that this guy is, it was done in aluminium because we had to be very, very light. We only had 500 kilos maximum, because Piano's project is also, it's a steel building. It moves like 14 centimeters during the day. So the whole thing is on, all of these volumes are on car springs, the springs between the chassis and the wheels. We have tons of springs under each of these volumes, just to take into account the shift of the building throughout the day. It's all hidden, essentially kind of seamless. But it's a project which, it's a restaurant now in its 21st year of existence. All the furniture was designed by us with Cappellini out of Milan. The lighting was Iguzzini, again, working with 2 great Italian manufacturers. We designed both aspects. The lighting in this case, we're not designers, we're architects, and our approach to a lot of those kinds of things like design tends to be we tend to play it down. We're not interested in playing up the stuff. It tends to come from, for us, it comes from architectural ideas. It doesn't just come out of a design world, but that's our angle, and the angle is the angle of an architect. The inside of these volumes is in rubber, made out of an organic latex rubber from Asia, that was started by a company out in the Loire Valley, and they're still going strong. So we're in a project which is still going very, very strong. It has an extraordinary existence, and no, it's something which we were, you know, very, very proud to work on. And we occasionally go back for dinner. Piano celebrates his birthday there every year, so we think that's kind of a fairly good sign.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Among other things.
Indeed. Well, you know, oh, wonderful. Shall we go on to next work, maybe? You know, after the Pont de Haut-de-Mer Theatre and the Renault Communication Center projects, where you installed work again in a pre-existing building, we don't have time, unfortunately. They're so interesting, but you started to win competitions, and it notably started with, you know, this massive Confluence development project area in Lyon, right? And eventually, so many of the big names, you know, would build Herzog de Meuron and Corps Pimmelblau, of course, the big museum at the very apex of the confluence of the rivers, and Tatiana Bilbao, Kengo Kuma, et cetera, et cetera. But your blocks, you know, they were between a rail yard, as I understand it, and this embankment, right? And
exactly.
These island pods.
Yeah, that's right. Essentially, the block represents the buildable space. We've always been very interested in this idea of building to the limit, or let's say materializing the limit, and then working with that as a kind of conceptual frame. In the orange cube and the green cube, that's absolutely the case. We can go as high, we can go as wide in all the senses. And then after that, of course, it became a kind of a deduction of what we could do in terms of the voids. The voids really come out of that fight, let's call it, between a limit and then the limit of the program, what was given to us, what they needed. But it was an interesting competition because the city started this competition. We were about, as you say, sort of 4 winners of a whole series of sites. We won 2 of the sites. And then we spent 2 or 3 years looking, along with the city, for a client to essentially buy the site and build the project. So it was one of these new ways of running a competition without a client, and then finding the client afterwards. Which, in a way, you know, we've always been asked what's better or worse. You know, there's no good answer to this question. You know, I think, sure, we had a freedom to imagine these things as 2 as opposed to 1. So of course we became very interested in this idea of a city of replication and iterance and difference, but using the same system. So that's why there's 2 pieces. They're like a kind of a family of pieces. We've always been asked, you know, where the hell is the 3rd piece? You know, we didn't win 3, we won 2. But it's we've always been interested in this idea of a kind of a city which you could wander across and actually see pieces that had a dialogue and conversation, were part of a discourse. I think, to me, the only place in the world where I found that, certainly the historical precedent has been in a number of projects in Rome, including, of course, the 4 Seasons, Borromini, Fountain, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, where you have this project for an experience in public space that touches a number of different sites, but it's been conceived to dialogue or discourse across those sites. Rome has them, and as I said, about 2 or 3 times, and they're extraordinary experiences. And I think that's something we very much were influenced by. So it has a, you know, Renaissance, ironically, a Renaissance, you know, origin. But other than that, you know, it's a project for offices at the top. It's cultural for the first layer. It's the blocks are right. You can see the river is an extraordinary river here. Just on the opposite side is really like a kind of an urban forest that has old villas, an old hospital, etc. inside of them. So the view out from the building onto those is amazing, and onto the river. And so the idea of doing these cones, of course, was to make a big profit from that negative space and make it a collective void space where people could come onto their balconies from each layer. So each layer has a different type of office. And they could come onto them, but they are heavily used, these spaces. They're, you know, a number of years ago, of course, we talked about them as almost breakout spaces, but I think that's a kind of pejorative term. I would say they're great spaces for barbecues. They're great spaces for people to meet, to talk, to do meetings. Lyon has a sort of microclimate of its own, even in winter. So they're very useful spaces. As you said, the oculus goes through the building. And what's interesting here is that none of this is done for, let's say, just a spatial gesture. It also has a really interesting impact on the climate of the building. This is a chimney, so air naturally comes down the river and up through the chimney. And we were able to do all of that with air studies to prove that you could open windows on the insides of this chimney and the oculus and get air moving sufficiently through the building in summertime to cool the building down. Then the orange, of course, the orange stuff is on the outside is this layer which keeps the light sun impact on the building. It reduces it radically. So it's a perforated layer. And it's a layer of tiny pixels, but faceted pixels, very much like the big cone. Anyway.
Yeah. So, you know, this is more about a heritage, I suppose, in that it seems to me that, you know, while your first project was obviously in a heritage protected interior, the first major project for Georges there. And then since then, you've done some very remarkable interiors for Florence Loewe and the Fondation Ricard and the Frédéric Malle Parfumerie, right in the center of town in Paris. You've generated forms through deformation and dissipation of these kind of reticulated surfaces that, you know, you saw as a surface or found as a surface with the Centre Pompidou, but then eventually you were working with three-dimensional grids and then deforming within that grid. So this is, I think, you know, must be your sort of the most important project, and certainly the one you're best known for, the FRAC in Orléans, and then of course. Just before that, the DOC project in Paris. Maybe you could just tell us how, you know, of course, heritage and working with older buildings has, you know, been around as long as architecture has, but, you know, how has your practice, you know, moved on, I think, as I think it has from the images at least, you know, on the heritage, dealing with heritage and those contexts?
Well, I think we've always been interested in history, and you know, the FRAC, as you can see, the building on the left hand and just in the back, it's what they call what would they call it? It's basically a food production building where foodstuffs were produced for the military, and in the 20th century. Before that, so that was already kind of an extraordinarily sort of strange aspect right in the heart of Orléans. So you have these three, you know, the perspex image of the building here is the old building that exists. And what we did essentially, and I'll just go forward, no, okay. What we did essentially was to take the two histories, you know, as you said, you know, we have an 18th century, we have a 19th century history. They don't come together. This site comes together as two different histories, two different building moments on its site. The site also I need to say, is like a lot of things in Europe, you know, there's layers, as everyone knows, there's layers to the site. Underneath the site is a 16th century convent. Along on the left-hand side is what is now what they call as the Maeve, which essentially is like the periphery of the Middle Ages city, which had a wall here that was destroyed in the Industrial Revolution. So that's what gives it the strong cut line. So we just have the stuff, you know, that we've got to work with. And so, but the most interesting immediate thing was that our project really had to take place on the inside between these two histories. And we knew that we were very interested in the kind of the land and the landform of that site and its history. So working with both sites, we're often interested, and that is something which really hasn't changed, Michael, is that we're very interested in often going into the geometry of the projects that has nothing to do with the language of the immediate, let's say architectural or building language, how it's made, what it's made out of, and just in the sense how it's developed as a language. It's got nothing to do with that. It's really more to do with the geometry of how the thing is structured and the structuring system. And in this case, we had two structuring systems. We had the 18th and the 19th century. And in working with them, we realized that the entry could possibly become actually this kind of confluence. The project is called the turbulence. And the turbulence for us was a very interesting metaphor because it was a place in which these two grids, two histories could come together to create a third condition. The third condition being a way then into entering, going through a doorway, essentially as you see in this image here. Those structuring grids are brought up. They're deformed from a concrete up through into a metallic surface. And this is a kind of wood layer on the inside, which you see in the other image. And all of this is kind of going up, getting light in, and creating also very interesting scenographic spaces which we've done. Of course, the FRAC has been exemplary in the world in terms of running, a very important Biennale of architecture, which you guys will be, I'm sure, well aware of over the years. It was really one of the first digital biennales in the world. And so the base has seen a lot of different exhibitions, a lot of really amazing stuff. But we had, this really for us was like a tent. And it was a tent of a kind of entry that gave us a way in to this stuff. And this stuff, of course, is the orthogonal. It's the old. We're in the 18th century part here, which actually was the food stoves, the kind of the major sort of factory part for the, which of course you couldn't tell that it was that today. Anyway, the point is that our approach hasn't really changed. It's been also, I would say it's an ongoing interest in working with the structure and the geometry of heritage pieces, as you say, and then trying to find a way in which the story can come together. In this case, it was two stories coming together to create a third, and the third being the turbulence. Not unlike an air condition for an aircraft. Yeah. And the turbulence in this case was, of course, a nice metaphor for creativity and ideas coming together and challenges, etc., which the FRAC is absolutely on the forefront of that.
Yeah. And then
this. Yeah, no. You're right. And then, so this thing is again, heritage. This is the old docks of Paris, 1907, designed by an engineer, not an architect. Went to Chicago, studied in the Chicago school, came back to France, studied steel construction. So you guys with the great some of the great architects in the period of the Chicago school that were doing Sullivan, all of these kinds of people that were doing some amazing stuff. But essentially steel was their major building material. So this engineer was studying the steel, thinking that he would come back to France and actually bring the steel, as a kind of an industrial, as an architectural or an engineering, what he was learning there, he could bring back to France and propose new structures. Well, it's very interesting, when he got back to France, actually he saw another revolution happening in France, which was concrete. And totally the opposite of what had been going on in Chicago. And he made this jump into concrete, from what we understand. Perrault was also, Auguste Perrault was also at that same period very interested in concrete, but in a different way. He was the architect, this was the engineer. And the commission here was to design a building probably about 3 times as long as this one, And what you see below here is just the concrete, of course, the concrete structure that became the docks of Paris, big industrial facility. And we were given the commission after an international competition. Our project, we call it the plug over. And the plug over is absolutely born out of all of this heritage condition in both I would say geometrical for sure, but for all sorts of other reasons. You know, of course, it's the impact of the influence of the river and the movement of the river. It's a lot of things. It's this idea of bringing a condition, exploring the fifth facade in a city of you know, let's say a landscape condition, which we found on top of the old building. So anyway, in this case, we took that precedent, and talking of precedents, and we pushed it up one floor, which we were allowed to, and we created this thing called the plug over. So the plug over is plugged over something that exists, and is absolutely very much a very visual addition to an existing thing. And I would say it's very much about that next generation after les grands projets, the big projects. This was much more about one which says, no, we're not demolishing, we're keeping. We did have an opportunity with the city of Paris. They told us you can get rid of it. And of course, we thought it was a total crime. You know, yes, we would have done it, you know, 30 years ago, probably. But we recognized the importance of keeping the structure way before this idea of resilience, you know, has been talked about. Also, it's a precedent because it proposes using the top surface of the city as a new landscape. So there's a number of important aspects about the project that you know, that came up, and you know, that we think have become kind of like precedents for other projects now, for other people. You know.
Yeah, indeed. I think we have to move on. I'm afraid, you know, because images of the roof and the river wall. Oh, lovely. And now recently you've had two pretty interesting. Oh, sorry. Your Parfumerie Frederic Malle, and we were going to move on to the C40 Reinventing Cities competition wins, this one in Saint-Denis and the one in Reykjavik Oster. Maybe if you could just give us a couple of minutes on this, because we've got a couple more topics to go and we're supposed to wrap up in about.
Yep, I know, exactly. So listen, I'll try and make it speed up a bit. Pleyel is north of Paris. Again, it's this it's kind of plug in or plug over, but in a sense, what it is called the energy plug in this case. And our client was EDF, which is the electricity company in France. And it was trying to create an alternative new vision for an industrial building, which had housed turbine cleaning equipment, basically to do with the electrical industry from the 1930s, now abandoned in the north of Paris, an extraordinary building, which they call the cathedral on the inside. And our project, winning project, really was proposing a wooden structure, entirely wood, with some concrete within it, essentially as this kind of a new center, social center, art center. It has in the back a growing wall for food production. It has a strong associative connectivity with the neighborhood. I'll just go through some images of that. So it gives you an idea of, in a sense, its language. Its language, again, comes very much out of a kind of condition, an existing geometrical condition. But, you know, you have this Art Deco concrete thing on the right, and then you have us with our emerging new world piece, which is both an energy roof. In the back, we have, of course, this vertical farming piece, which we've been developing. So it's the energy plug. And then I would go on and talk about another project, which was also for the C40 competition, you know, and it was a nice. And it's in Reykjavik, and it's housing. It's called Living Landscape. It's housing built around a landscape, essentially a forest, so that it gives a huge number of people this idea of living in the urban situation, but living in an ecological structure. It's Iceland's biggest wood building ever built. It's not under construction yet. We hope it will be. And essentially it's these layers coming together. The rooftop, a series of glass houses, communal glass houses, essentially giving you some idea of the planning. We have students in there, we have older people, we have so it's a lot of mixity of different groups. This is part of a model which we've been building for Seoul, which you touched on as a point.
Yeah.
So that's now delivered and will be opening, I think, in the next couple of days in Seoul, as the Biennale of Seoul, which we're very excited to be.
Yeah, indeed. And yes, thank you for this prompt here, the Maison Connectée. I'll just say that it is such an astonishing form. I'm saying here that it has a kind of figurative quality, and rather like a body, I suppose you could say, and it strikes me too that maybe you say you work in a former textile industry space, and around couturier, and I'm wondering here whether you're kind of draping the body of the building in something like a Rick Owens cape of triangulated mesh steel, etc. But I guess I'd just say that it looks like a building that's being presented to the public like a figure, to take its sort of public role in the city as a body, I guess I could say. Maybe just tell us a little bit about it before we move on to the last questions.
It's interesting. I think the thing is that if you look in this plan view, what we have inside is actually a highly orthogonal structure.
Oh.
And we have that because we're dealing with basically also a house which has 5 floors, but a number of those floors have a lot of rooms which are highly orthogonal in their planning. And of course, all of that loading as a structure comes down into the basement, which is also quite orthogonal, ironically. But what is interesting is that orthogonal condition, when it comes to the edge, connects through to another layer, as you say. What is important, though, is that other layer is informed by that orthogonal condition as it comes to the outside. In other words, a little bit different from a piece by Rick Owens, which, let's say, would take the body and, as you say, drapes around the body. In this case, the body becomes the drape. And if one plays back the skin, in a sense, of the outside, one actually comes back into, these tubes, for example, these tubes are all structural tubes. They go right through the building, and they hold on top of it each floor. So it's a total body. So you do have an effect of a double layer for all sorts of reasons. The neighbors did not want to be looked at. And so we have these very acute views, and also the guys living inside did not also want to look straight onto the garden of someone. So there was urban rules that we had to work with on the sides. It's interesting. It's built within the memory of an older building which the clients demolished before we got to the site, which was the wooden Swiss chalet. And ironically, it had a peaked roof, and the only reason we could build on this site is because we had that building envelope there.
Grandfathered.
So anyway, coming from all of that, it describes why we are working with a condition which is a kind of a 3-dimensional. It's much more complex. It's a 3-dimensional thing. Although it may have this layer, it is a layer, and there's a void here, and then there's another layer. It's very much a kind of a 3-dimensional thing. And as you can see down here this is sort of the last floor before the underground. And again, this kind of condition of a kind of a Voronoi, let's say, structure, is it comes into that level down below. Again, it hooks back into a larger rectangle below the building. These are some conditions that I wanted to pop into, kind of it's a little bit maybe related to the language of this. Essentially, it's based around the metaphor of a tree, the house, and it rises up through the building. So you've got layers and you've got rings, and the outer ring is the layer that you're referring to.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I you know, this is your ADES exhibition work, isn't it, in Berlin? I was wondering whether maybe we need to move on to the Tonga Above project and then wrap up. You know, if we don't, it's rather sad. We've had a question in the chat working with artists, and I had hoped that we would talk about that. Maybe we can just for a minute at the end, but can you move to the Tonga Above project and show us that?
Yeah. Absolutely. I wanted it. In fact, I can do all of it quite fast. This is an image of my partner, Dominic, on the left-hand side. And the thing floating in the foreground is a drawing in augmented reality, which is actually a moving film showing the conceptual way in which those cones came into the cube, the orange cube. And so it's a film that tells a story, but it's invisible. You have to have an app to see it and through a screen like that. And so that touches on an issue to do with the ongoing kind of experimentation, a lot having to do with what you don't see. We're very interested in this kind of area. Some of the design work we've been doing was a bottle that we did for Ricard. This is Tonga, and again, I'll touch on it Tonga is, like many of the islands in the Pacific, are undergoing rising water levels and also storms. So there's two major forces on the island of Tonga. We think the capital is going to be inundated in the future. So our project is a theoretical project that we've been developing with an artist, a local artist, a Tongan artist, to reimagine the Tonga of the future. And so this is what we'll be proposing. These images are really a tiny amount of what we'll be showing. So it doesn't really very well present the project here. But and again, I'm just focusing on a tiny piece of that. It's a coming together of two things. One is the interest of coral formation and how that can be an extraordinary way in which to build up a new city off an existing marine condition, both a structural thing and also taking as a kind of from nature, the way nature approaches making these kinds of structures. And we're going up, of course, because we're trying to kind of bring up, grow away from that rising water, and also becoming a stronger structure to do with fighting against those storms. So these are kind of some of the images that we've been developing. So I think that's kind of, I'm finishing there quickly in order to give over the, the talk.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, we have had a question, as I say, about working with artists. And I am aware that you have worked with artists in a number of projects. Maybe if you could just answer about that in general with respect to some of your other works, to give a sense of how they've taken, you work with them and they've taken your ideas and added to it. I mean, I did have a question around ornamentalism and your work, but this might suffice.
Yeah, I think, or maybe I don't show you the image because you've seen it. But there's Euronews. Remember the green project from the outside? It's a good example of working with artists. We have a really strong interest in the art world. We always have had, and for us, it's absolutely we're very interested in working with artists at the very beginnings of projects, not at the end. Sometimes they've come in at the end just because historically that's how it's developed. But Fabrice Hibert, a very famous French artist, was very much responsible for the, let's say, the tattooing or the perforating of the green project. We had a methodology that we developed for the orange project, but then with Fabrice, we said, okay, it's yours. You work with this surface if your if your concept is something which you're comfortable with. His concept was originally something to do with, obviously, water. And sound, and the piece is called Les Ondes, which has to do, again, it's an invisible thing. It's the sound waves, and he took that, and we worked closely with Fabrice. He went through a series of sketches. I haven't had time to because that's another whole body of material just to talk about art, but we had some fantastic sketches of Fabrice where he took us through this imaginary world of sound and also water. So he was trying to make the story of the river, and he was trying to make the story of waves, sound waves. So the two are one thing, and the facade with Fabrice is something we spent a huge amount of time ping pong backwards and forwards with them on that. So it's interesting, our work with an artist isn't as necessarily to say, okay, you do it, you know, we're trying to answer the question there from your audience. We're very much interested in saying, no, hang on, there's something we've done, and we would like it to be more like a ping pong, you know? Yeah. And in this case, it was absolutely, with Fabrice, it was absolutely that. We got to the point where it's kind of like a hand in glove. And, you know, yes, the buildings are kind of a Jakob MacFarlane building, but then actually there's the work of Fabrice Hibert, and you guys should look into his work. It's extraordinary work. You know, he brings another whole realm which we could never have done on that project. And I think it's that kind of dialogue which gives, can give incredible resonance to a work. You know, you look at it, you think, well, hang on, what's going on here? There's depth, there's you know, where is that? Of course, if you're working with another person that's outside of what you're doing, invariably, I think something will be richer and more interesting. And so that's been our philosophy with working with artists. We've worked with a bunch of very, very well-known French artists, essentially.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, it was just lovely to see the images, the night images of the FRAC with the electronic shadow group working and, you know, pumping in data from weather and traffic. And so exciting. The building just is another building, isn't it? In the evening.
Well, that was with a group called Electronic Shadows, and they were amazing because they came with a drawing. You know, again, it went out. We said, listen, this is what we're working with as a form, as a surface, and the story of the two grids coming together. They went away. They came back, and a week later, they came to our office and showed us a drawing, and it has a point, a line, and a surface. And they had a whole discourse about how the origins of architectural representation could be taken back into the surface. And if they coupled that with live data, which the FRAC's electronic surface is coupled with meteorological conditions over Orléans, the city of Orléans. So we have live contextual data with this principle of a kind of a point line surface. And that's what creates this piece. And it's a piece that through an algorithmic base and a server within the FRAC creates unique pieces. And then they're never the same.
Brendan, thank you so much. We've ended with some lovely, you know, kind of interesting collaborative work that I know you're doing and continue to do. And there were questions around what's next and some thoughts about your work in general, but we have to leave them, I guess. But I thankfully you did answer some questions around, we got around your working by the water, and was there some way in which your work responded to that? You've actually answered that question for one of the people querying that, so that's great. But so thanks so much for showing your work today and enduring my internally long questions sometimes. But I have to say, I've had a crash course in MacFarlane and Jakob this last week, and it's been really a good time. And we now have an insight into your work, and hopefully we get you here yourself in before too long. And
that would be really great, because I know when I got the invitation from Auckland, I was like, wow, that's fantastic. I'll be you know, I can go somewhere. And, you know,
no, it's just a phone call. Anyway, thanks for agreeing to appear at the event, and for the support your office has given as well. And I'll let you get on with your work day. It's the end of the day for us and start for you. So thanks, and hope we actually do meet one day. It would be a great pleasure, and of course for our students to hear about your work, more of your work. And
but thanks very much for making this happen, Michael.
Okay.
That's really appreciated. Thanks to the university, and thanks for all the people that attended today.
Yes.
And I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of the questions, but anyway, maybe next time.
Yeah. We'll do we'll do another one someday, I hope. Okay. Cheers. Well,
thanks very much.
Yeah. See you then, Brendan. Take care. Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. So now, it's just for everybody here, a final reminder that next week there's a session in the Fast Forward Spring Series on the 21st. That's Tuesday the 21st, but it's at lunchtime at 1 o'clock. And it's with Julia Gappy in conversation with Dr. Alexandra Jae-Eun Lee and Rowan Fraser, architectural graduates making careers outside of architecture. So please head to our website, fastforward.ac.nz, for details to register for that webinar or use the QR code. And so with that, I should say thank you very much for attending. And I'm sorry if it dragged on a bit for you, if you had plans for this extra 20 or so minutes, but I think Brendan's work was well worth delving into a bit longer. Take care. Thank you. Good night.